If you suddenly started living in a more totalitarian society, no worries, it happens to everybody and there are some solutions to it. Usually, a government can become totalitarian when it uses legal ruses in constitution. Today's governments are more totalitarian than anything before because Lukashenko in Belarus and Putin in Russia actually openly say that they persecute their political opponents and they don't see anything wrong with this. And it's a new stage of cynicism where basically governmental leaders can say something like this and still have no responsibility and see no consequences for such statements. Recent developments in Russia show that art became a new tool of just terrorizing different people. Artists are persecuted for really unclear reasons, seemingly ethical, but the general feeling is just repression and fear. Yes, yes, yes. In 2021, Russian government is persecuting rap singers and comedians for making wrong statements, for singing about drugs or sexuality. It should be expected that in 2022 we'll see a return to social realism when ideology is totally represented in art, probably in film, literature. I guess writers like Sorokin will just lose their citizenship as it happened 50 years ago in the 70s. Socialist realism is the stupidest approach to the reality. It's the approach of omniscience. In simple words, it means that you know everything about the world, and so you act according to your science. From today's perspective, it's more like a mindset of a maniac, but in science fiction, it was called the progressor, and I talked about this in the episode about Strugatsky. This position of the progressor is completely secure from any criticism and it's closed for self reflection, of course. It's protected by constant reference to whataboutism. It doesn't speak of itself, it has negative definition of its own identity, but this subject is looking for a negative definition of oneself. If you're forced to live in the aesthetics of social realism, and most likely it's going to be the case in Russia, then you'll have to find a way to express yourself in arts to be free. And this is not me who is saying this. This is the thesis of Shakhnazarov in his political science and concept that influenced the ideology of Perestroika. Return to a totalitarian government is tradition. There is nothing new in this. And it's good news too, because there is already an antidote in that culture that can be revived. This is the weakness of Putin's political system as well. It uses dogmatic approaches to disciplining the society, so society can emancipate itself in the same way as it did 30 years ago. When someone says that there is no alternative to Putin and there are no other possibilities for development, it's really funny because, well, it's easy to imagine a flourishing Russia with just proper capitalism instead of oligarchy pumping coal and oil for their own profits. I can tell you from right on that the people who reformed Soviet society in the 80s were at the top of government from the 60s. They were so-called silent dissidents. They were associated with the journal called World Marxist Review. It was based in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, and Gorbachev's advisors all worked at the journal in the 60s. They witnessed Soviet invasion in Prague in 1968, and they were repulsed. They also felt alien, as Shakhnazarov's memoirs of 2001 suggested. It's quite logical that the people who brought the Soviet Union to ultimate collapse and fostered decommunization were the top ideologists who were supposed to negotiate Soviet ideology with the world. My character here, Georgi Shakhnazarov, was one of 12 Gorbachev's advisors who modified the whole system. And the main thing is that they changed from monoparty system to multi-party system, ending the monopoly of Marxism-Leninism in ideology. They substituted one and correct ideology with a pluralism, which included also tolerance towards religion instead of scientific atheism, which was scientific method dealing with religious feeling. Shakhnazarov was especially proud of authoring the law that ended censorship in 1989. Let me sum up this again. Right at the core of the Communist Party, there was a circle of ideologues who later became Gorbachev's advisors, and they decided that the Soviet Union has no right to exist. They were so-called silent dissidents, and although we may say that they were silent, actually they were noticeable. In 1982, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a dissident but also probably a KGB agent, published a work called About Pluralists, where he said that there is one pluralist among dissidents, Andrei Sakharov, but also a group of privileged ideologists at the World Marxist Review. Besides that, there are competitors from the Moscow Humanitarian University published works where they named these future Gorbachev's advisors. It's Shakhnazarov, Burlatsky, Yakovlev, Chernyayev, Rumyantsev, Frolov, Arab Agli, and some others that basically defined the discourse and the priorities of the new government during Perestroika. For instance, Mamardashvili was part of the World Marxist Review circle, but he did not belong to Gorbachev's advisors. Mamardashvili was from the same village as Stalin. He considered Stalin his personal enemy, and he created a philosophical theory that is similar to the ideology of pluralism here, that kind of inspired first Georgian president Shevardnadze, who said that Mamardashvili is one of the greatest influence on him, but it didn't prove him to be right. Shevardnadze was actually another corrupted leader, and philosophy didn't help. These people were the copywriters of Perestroika, of Soviet pluralism. Their creation, their discourse, came into power after 70 years of Marxism-Leninism. It also started dehumanization. Marxism-Leninism stopped being considered science. It lost its legitimacy completely. It was the past. There was definitely a huge shift in the language of the government during Perestroika. It changed the language forever. A lot of notions disappeared, and class stopped being so important. Being a woman or a young person became as much ideological as being of a certain class. It's possible to trace in every Gorbachev's long speech or in the Constitution of 1989. In that constitution, even the word class is barely used. It's actually substituted with the term layer. So while working for the World Marxist Review journal in Prague in the 60s, Shakhnazarov described the feeling of alienation and also shame and disgust towards Soviet government in 1968. And so they became silent dissidents already there and waited for a moment to change the ideology top down. Two of Gorbachev's advisors, Georgi Shakhnazarov and Eduard Arab-Ogli, wrote about science fiction as a political tool in the 70s. I think Shakhnazarov is more interesting for me here because he wrote science fiction under a pen name Georgi Shakh. And his novel can explain a lot more than scientific books on ideologies. Shakhnazarov was the one who not only claimed that he uses science fiction for what he called social modeling, he also was who was really interested in mass culture, and he argued for political speculations in science fiction on Soviet TV in 1984. Shakhnazarov's breakthrough happened in 1979 with his book Fiasco of Futurology, and it's a book that actually hybridizes science fiction with political theory, and he puts it even further in his essay, scientific essay, Science Fiction and Futurology in 1986. Those who know Stanislav Lem have already noticed probably the names, the titles of these books, that they actually reference Stanislav Lem's book Science Fiction and Futurology in 2 volumes, 1970 and 1972. Futurology was a really ambiguous term. For Marxism-Leninism, it was, of course, authority, bourgeois science that, of course, is not scientific then. And Shakhnazarov, as well as actually Sakharov, wrote several works in the discourse of futurology, which actually became a huge part of the discourse of Perestroika. The book Fiasco of Futurology is intended for Soviet ideological workers and also Euro-communists and world communists that would read and discover such an open-hearted ideologist from the Soviet Union, who actually proven to be a silent dissident later. This book is still a huge source for Western readers on futurology in the world. You can check Goodreads or you can go to New York Strand, and that's going to be the only book on futurology there. Fiasco of Futurology, again, 1979, has 2 parts on science fiction. The first part is about Western science fiction, and the other one is actually a short story that describes dystopian thinking. So actually, Shakhnazarov defined the ideology of pluralism in this weird in-betweenness of science and fiction. And I guess it's really important that he spoke of this dystopian mentality in which optimism and omniscience, knowledge of everything, are impossible. It's important to resist the possibility of monolithic understanding of everything. There is always a fracture in society, and if someone thinks the other way, it's because of ideology. So another advisor, Arabogli, also engaged with Lem's writings, and he introduced the key terms for the dystopian thinking, the labyrinth, the dead end of ideologies. It was already ready in the 70s. The ideology of pluralism has its own hint. It's a humanistic impulse. It shows that no ideology can reduce freedom, because freedom is feeling. Feelings are beyond ideologies. They are inscribed in bodies. In Shakhnazarov's writings, definitely he believes in playfulness, and that playfulness is the way to modificate the feeling. To oppose dogmatism of ideologies like Marxism-Leninism, one does not have to be a political activist. It's enough to be an artist or a lover to create a challenge for such an ideology. So it's natural that these ideologies fracture from time to time and go in vain. Shakhnazarov shows different feelings that transcend ideologies. It's feeling of respect, of friendship, of rightfulness, justice. So there is something that unites people beyond ideologies, but these feelings should be felt. To be not repressed and feel is a huge privilege of democratic societies. But if someone is not in a democratic society, one would need to do an exercise of decompressing and becoming emancipated. In his novel, For Now Was a Story of Marwu, Shakhnazarov made a grotesque portrayal of Marxist-Leninist society. He portrayed class consciousness as clan consciousness. This is a society where laws and logic seem to be okay, but the tradition and human behavior are deviating from it a lot, like it's in socialist countries. The novel also shows what the pluralists did in their political discourse, in their ideology. they essentialized that any society is pluralistic. They no longer described society as governed by hegemonic ideology with some possible dissent. No. The world of the planet Hermes, this isolated world actually, is ruled by many factors, many parties. Some of them are in underground, some of them are intellectual and waiting for a moment to be introduced. And there is always this dynamism, despite the claim of ideology to be eternal and always true and scientific. There is a really interesting scientific anthropological account by Yuri Yurchak, who published a book, It Was Forever Until It Was No More, about this feeling of eternity that is governed by Marxism-Leninism and how it was felt and lost when the Soviet Union collapsed. Some people call it stability, but this stability came with a price tag, so there should be no nostalgia for it. And the price was actually taking away freedom of alterity, of being different and foreign. The processes on the planet are shown as changing due to the feeling that people have. Sometimes they are afraid, sometimes they are eager to kick asses, and it can be kind of channeled by political parties. And the expectation is that there is always a possibility for a change to democracy. It's natural. The stasis that Marxism-Leninists promised for the proletarians was a lie. Actually, the Soviet Union was an oligarchy, and we still see an oligarchy in Russia and other post-Soviet countries. It just carried on. I guess there are some differences between who Shakhnazarov was and who is the subject of the ideology of pluralism. And let me focus on the subject in the ideology. This subject is something like Shakhnazarov's literary persona. So Shakhnazarov published under his pen name Shah, and he has a theatrical play called Shah and Mat, Check and Mate. And I think that this is how one should imagine the feeling that a reformator feels. That there are lots of battles, there is some practice, that there is always a chance to replay, but there should be always a possibility to hide one's intention in several moves. The shift from faith in Marxism-Leninism, or actually fear, was due to the feeling. People just followed this feeling, right? Whatever ideology claims, it depends on whether people feel it. The subject that Shakhnazarov shows in his writings does not approach the reality in ultimate terms. It's more like playing and trying to win with no fear to lose. But the stake is not an actual reality, but fictional reality, a desire for difference. The subject of a game player is self-reflective because game repeats. It has rules which one has to obey, but at the same time, every game is unique and really takes a player through different emotions. Of course, some real conservative listener would ask me, what would happen if the rules of chess changed one day? Is it the same as the rules of society? Would they create the same trouble, the same openness of what the chess is now? Well, I guess there are already certain chess that have different rules. There are Russian chess, they're called Chapayev. You basically take pawns and you kick them. That's how you win. The winner is the one who kicks out the most pawns of the opponent. Shakhnazarov's novel really conceals a lot of problems. For instance, of right-wingers taking over but self-destroying themselves, so like more moderate politics can come in power. But even without any political differences, there is certain tendency of an isolated society to want to join a bigger union. Shakhnazarov takes this big union from Ivan Yefremov's utopian novel Andromeda Nebula, 1957. It's called The Great Ring. There are two features of the ideology of pluralism. One is obvious, and the other one is actually the opposite to obvious. So the obvious one is that the society shifted from a monistic, unitary one to a pluralist one, and it was essential that there is no homogeneity in society. A monistic, dogmatic society usually ponders on the idea that there is no fraction in the society. The ideology of pluralism says the opposite. There is always a fracture, there is always a possibility for change. The less obvious thing is what happened to the Soviet subject, the person who lived in the Soviet Union and had to go through this epistemological shift from monism to pluralism. What was his or her life like? This new subject of Perestroika saw something else on TV, had to engage with the government in a different democratic way, go and vote and choose and decide whether to conserve Marxism-Leninism or try something else and what this else could be. It's really interesting that a discourse analysis of the term perestroika has shown that this term existed in the 20s and 30s and was used ambiguously. It meant to change oneself according to social rules, to shift in perception. Historians of Soviet Union, Tsygankov and also Fadeev, pointed to the shift that happened in the definition of the term perestroika in Gorbachev's speeches in 1989. Basically, Fadeev showed that Gorbachev started defining perestroika as deconstruction, demontage of the Soviet system. But actually, before that, it meant to change oneself. And Shakhnazarov's novel actually used the term perekroika, changing one's own dimensions. I think actually perestroika are two things. It's one's modification through changing the perception of the reality, through changing the feeling of the reality, is the proper step towards emancipation. Playfulness is this non-ideological way to constitute alterity, to be the other in a presumably monistic world. The freedom of feeling is beyond ideology, and this is the freedom that proves that no ultimate prison can be built. It's really informative to look at Shakhnazarov's writing through the prism of the Amnesty International's member, like Turchin, who introduced the concept of inertia of fear, and he believed that the Soviet society did not change in the 60s because of certain inertia of choices in possible democratic situations. Strugatsky actually formulated it well in their novel The Snail on Slope, 1966. It is a tradition that has lost its why long ago. Nobody remembers why it appeared at all, but everyone carries it out. The inertia of fear, as it is in Turchin and it can be seen in Shakhnazarov's novel, is not just the fear that repeats itself. No, it's inertia in choosing fear in the situation where response can be absolutely different, like a consolidated retaliation of people who want to be free. There is an optimistic impulse in Shakhnazarov's novel that even a dystopian totalitarian society can be pushed out of this dead end. But at the same time, his novel conceals the main problem with right-wing violence. The government of right-wingers led by Golem kills itself, and that's how a more reasonable government comes in, of a philosopher called Deleuze. I think this philosopher actually is a reference to Gilles Deleuze. I think so because the philosopher who leads the democratic movement is a philosopher of language as a barrier between social clans, and that reform of the language is an ideological reform for this totalitarian society. The problem of the language is a material manifestation of clan consciousness on the planet because people speak different languages. Mathematicians start using formulas to express their feelings. People working on the land use more biological metaphors. So in the end, they required a new technology called up to communicate between each other. And it seems like an advanced technology, but at the same time, it shows their limitation in communication and their ideological boundaries that they created for different members of society. The resolution of the whole playfulness of the novel is in the death of Romeo and Juliet, who are Roma and Ula in the story. Their death happens because of their psychological repression that they feel after they lose the application to communicate between each other. And this happens because of a terroristic attack from the underground that actually wants to end a new progressive regime. So there's always this possibility to get depressed by either underground or the government. The whole thing is the psychology, the feeling, the resistance to the forced, coerced subjecthood. So it's not surprising that the place where the feeling and the language are two really important and studied subjects is science fiction. And working with the aesthetics of science fiction in Shakhnazarov's novel is the way to communicate the ideology of pluralism to mass audience. As the history of the ideologues of Perestroika and Perestroika itself show, there is always this moment in history where there is a call for huge reformation. And this reformation will be top-down, it will be ideological. And this preparation does not happen within the moment, within the opening for the political change. It actually prepared for decades. So there is always important to have in mind the plan for the peaceful times. And I guess that Shakhnazarov, with his creativity and his works from the 60s to the 90s and his memoirs from the 90s actually show a really interesting mind that resisted ideology from top-down level.